Hello and welcome to some more video notes. Today we're looking at 5.2, which is on natural selection. So basically, these notes are going to go through the process of natural selection, the steps that are required for natural selection to occur, and then we're going to be looking at some specific examples of that support this idea that natural selection has happened, in So during these notes, we'll be covering all of the criteria, the understandings. We'll be looking at what natural selection is. We'll be looking at how meiosis and mutation and sexual selection cause variation in a population. And then we'll be talking about how that variation eventually leads to adaptations increasing in a population over time, which ultimately culminates into evolution. This, of course, being powered by this natural selection, the natural forces around the organisms that decide whether or not something has better traits and are more likely to survive and reproduce versus having negative traits and being less likely to survive and get to reproduce. And then we'll be spending some time talking about antibiotic resistance and how at a microscopic level we can see natural selection at play as bacteria become resistant to antibiotics that we use to fight diseases. And then we'll also be looking at Darwin's finches and how those finches, as we study them, how we can see natural forces affecting their development over time. So you're probably aware that natural selection was kind of created or best written and is then attributed to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, like a lot of other researchers at the time, was looking into the concept of evolution, about how populations might be changing over time, why certain species seem to go extinct, but they look similar to species that still exist today. And so through his life, he was basically, as a naturalist, he was researching these ideas, and it took him quite a long time to eventually come up with the theory of evolution due to natural selection. If you were think about mapping out his life, you would say that he was born in 1809, and he was very old, Charles Darwin, but he used to be a young person, right? Maybe he thought he was quite handsome. And as a young man, he started off on his journey on the HMS Beagle, which was a 3 to 4 year journey, basically going around the Earth. And as he was doing that, he was collecting samples of different locations of organisms, of birds and reptiles, amphibians, things like that, mammals. He was drawing pictures. He was physically capturing some of them and bringing them back. For some of them, he also found, for some places, he also found fossils and had fossil evidence of organisms that might have existed in that area of the world before. And then eventually coming back to London, I don't know if he's from London, but coming back to the UK, and he starts to try to formulate some type of mechanism for why species seem to diverge, or why do we get some variations in the different groups. For example, he was studying these finches around the Galapagos Island, which we'll talk about towards the end of these video notes. And that's why we call them Darwin's finches, because he studied them so well. And so we'd be looking at why do these different groups of finches have variations in their physical structures? What is it about them, about the environment, that might have caused them to develop that way? And eventually he starts to contact his friend Alfred Russel Wallace. They call him Darwin's bulldog because he was the one who kind of went to the mound for went to the plate for Darwin to kind of bat for him and try to defend his ideas. Darwin wasn't really necessarily a big public speaker. He didn't have the guts to go and debate people for long periods of times and very aggressively about his ideas. But Wallace believed in him, believed his ideas, and kind of went to become the public figure to help spread his ideas around. But really it was a good number of years, over a decade, after he'd finished his journey and where he was collecting and analyzing all of this data, all of his observations, all the fossils he's collected, and working on his first book, which is the idea of origin of species by natural selection, basically him trying to explain how species can diverge and how natural selection can affect the development or the changes of a species over time. And it took quite a long time for him to organize all of his thoughts. Then, not too long after that, we discovered our Archaeopteryx, which is our kind of middle ground between early dinosaur reptiles and modern birds, the kind of in-between snapshot, helping to provide more evidence that reptiles possibly evolved into birds back as the Earth went through traumatic changes towards the end of the Jurassic periods. And eventually survival of the fittest coming out later on, where people kind of coining this term of survival of the fittest based on his ideas of natural selection. So it's kind of just an overview of his life, and just here to emphasize this idea that really substantial work in science and in biology in particular, it might not be something that happens quickly within a few years or even a decade. It can take multiple decades of work before someone can really come through with a solid piece of an argument or hypothesis well supported with evidence that they've collected. So we talk about natural selection. If we want to use Darwin's word, we're basically looking at an environment where we can doubt that individuals having an advantage, however slight, over others would have the best chance of surviving and procreating their kind. He's basically saying this idea that those with a trait that gives them some type of heightened probability of survival, therefore would have a better chance of getting an opportunity to reproduce. So when we talk about these slight differences between members in a population, this culminates to the idea of variation. And so variation within a species is important between members of a population of a species, because variation often adds strength to the individual, or not necessarily the individual, but the population as a whole, and therefore as the species has a better chance of basically dealing with variations in the environmental conditions like food supply, weather, and things like that. So we don't want necessarily all individuals to be exactly the same, both genetically and also phenotypically, because it makes them more vulnerable to shifts in a population or an environment that would affect the population. Give you an example of bananas, right? So if you've had a banana somewhere that you bought in the store, you may not be aware, but those are all exactly identical to each other. All the bananas that we're kind of growing right now are basically clones of one crop of banana that survived a great kind of plight on banana species back in the early 1900s, I think. I can't remember exactly what decade it happened in. But basically, there used to be more variation in the banana population until a virus spread through banana populations, through banana plantations, and wiped out a lot of them. And it just so happened that there was one group or a couple groups of bananas, a couple populations of banana trees that were resistant to this virus. And so from there, we kind of reintroduced or propagated the crop that became our global banana supply. Now, this is a problem because there's not a lot of genetic variation within the current, global banana population, the ones that you're buying at the store. So there is kind of a fear that a new virus someday in the future that would affect that specific strain or that specific grouping of bananas could appear. And then because they're all genetically similar to each other, they would all be affected equally. And then that could, again, almost wipe out our banana population, have a huge impact on, the economics and, food supplies that go along with the banana tree. So it's an example where not having a lot of genetic variation actually is a really negative thing. So variation is a good thing. And so within a population, we would expect to see a certain amount of variation. All right, for example, here, looking at our ladybirds or ladybugs here, there are about 100 different types of forms of coloration that can occur all around the world. So even though they're the same species, these ones here, the harlequin ladybirds, are all the same species, there are hundreds of different forms that they could appear in, different colorations that they could appear in. And depending on where they are, different colorations could possibly give different advantages or disadvantages. Darker coloration might be more of an advantage if you're trying to hide in shadier areas from other birds that might try to consume you, where brighter coloration might be an advantage for reproduction or even scaring away some predators. Sometimes bright colors can give off the impression to a predator that you are poisonous and therefore decrease the probability that the predator will eat you because it doesn't want to get poisoned or get sick from consuming you. So variations in the population in terms of how they appear and how the environment reacts to those various traits are eventually what's going to cause natural selection to happen. Okay? So when we think about variation in population, you've already discussed, and you should remember where variation is coming from. So you remember variation, right? So variation, probably the first and foremost where you think about variation coming from would be random mutations, right? Substitutions, deletions, insertions of nucleic acids in our DNA. If it shows up in a gene, if it changes the amino acid sequence, then the protein, the primary sequence will be different, which causes the secondary sequence to possibly different, which causes the tertiary sequence to possibly be different. And then because of that, the three-dimensional structure of the protein is different enough that maybe it functions better or maybe it functions worse. And so a random mutation which causes a better protein could mean that maybe we increase the probability of that that organism getting to survive, and then could lead to natural selection as a benefit for them. Okay, this could also occur in DNA replication, is where these mutations most likely occur, but it also could happen from viruses that when proviruses insert their DNA into a host cell's DNA, they alter the sequence by doing that. And so a certain amount of traits in complex organisms like reptiles and birds and mammals, that variation is coming from viruses affecting our DNA and then just never really re-emerging from the cell. So they basically altered our DNA and then nothing really came of it in terms of the virus affecting us in any other way. We also get it through sexual reproduction. If you remember meiosis, meiosis creates a lot of variation through crossing over, so our recombination of sections of homologous chromosomes during prophase 1. And then we have our random assortment, so the random separating of homologous chromosomes and sister chromatids during the process of meiosis, both in metaphase 1 and metaphase 2. And then we also have the randomness of fertilization. Remember, thanks to sexual reproduction of crossing over, random assortment, random separation, and then random fertilization, you're one of possibly 7 trillion versions of you that could have existed just from that one time that there was the successful fertilization of an egg with a single sperm. So there's tons and tons of variation coming from our sexual reproduction as well. So it's a random mutation in combination with our sexual reproduction. So if you also need a more visual going along with this, to genetic variation here with our crossing over occurring in prophase 1, creating new recombinations of alleles, right, mixing up the dominant and recessive alleles we talked about in topic 3. And then of course the random assortment of chromosomes in metaphase 1, that creates over 8 million combinations just from that, so that there's a lot of variation that happens. So really it's just so much more variation comes with sexual reproduction. So typically we find that sexually reproducing organisms evolve faster and are a little bit more stable for dealing with changes in their environment. So when we're talking about these variations, okay, these mutations that occur in our DNA sequence that are causing some type of physical change in our proteins, we give it an advantage if it's something that is going to be selected for. We consider it to be an advantage if the environment selects for it. So that means that natural selection is saying that you're increased your chance of surviving if you have this trait, which increases your chance of reproduction. You get to live longer, so you have a better chance of reproducing. It's a disadvantage if it's natural selection is selecting against it. If the environment is saying, well, if you have this trait, it's more likely that you're going to die before you get to reproduce. So you have less likely that you're going to survive. And because of that, your genes might not get to pass on to the next generation because you never live long enough in order to reproduce. So really it's one or the other. A trait is either going to increase chance of something's survival so that it gets to reproduce, or decrease its chance of survival, and so therefore it decreases its ability to potentially reproduce. And with natural selection, over time, the environment should be filtering out all of the things that are selected against, and then the ones that are selected for should start to increase in number, and eventually leading to the overall evolution of that population. So now that we have variation, the next thing that's going to have to happen if we're going to have natural selection is that there needs to be way more individuals produced than the environment can contain and can hold. There's more resources for it. This is really for two reasons. One is that there needs to be selection pressure. There needs to be, not enough food, not enough water, not enough shelter, so that those with the negative traits are negatively affected, right, by those traits, and so they're less likely to reproduce. And those with positive traits are more likely to reproduce. So we need competition. And then the other reason why this is going to occur, or is important for natural selection to occur, is because of that competition, not everything gets to survive, right? We need to select individuals out of the population that gets to stay on and reproduce, and select individuals that die too early to get to reproduce. And so that means that you're going to produce a lot of offspring, but a large percent of those offspring are never going to really make it to adulthood. So typically we see in nature that there is an abundance amount of offspring being produced by members in a specific population of a certain species. Typically smaller individuals like frogs and insects, certain birds, because they have small bodies, they have faster development, they have shorter lifespan, so they develop really quickly into adults, they reproduce fairly quickly, then they die relatively quickly after being born. They normally produce very high number of offspring, and they know that to a certain extent a large of that number of that offspring are going to die, and they're never going to make it to adulthood. Typically organisms with slower life plans, like elephants and tortoises and human beings and gorillas, for example, they put more energy into raising their young. So they typically have, groups of children. Normally they have 1 to 5 maybe offspring at any one time in that population, but they put more effort into making sure that those individuals survive, doing parenting, protecting them, raising them as they develop, helping them with food, helping them keep away from predators and things like that, teaching them skills that they need to survive. But ultimately, if we're really looking at populations in the wild, not necessarily humans, which are modifying their environment all the time, but even slow life population groups are having more offspring than are really expected to survive, and that the environment can actually hold. So this competition is still maintained. So because of these offspring and because of this competition, that's where we get our struggle to survival, right? So the idea that we have to compete against each other in order to reproduce, compete against each other to get enough food, to get enough water, enough space. And so we think about struggle of survival, there's different categories or different factors that could be coming in causing this struggle. So first off, competition for food, probably one of the biggest ones, how hard it is to find it, to reach, to catch the food. Digesting the food is also, you might have an advantage. You might have a better formed digestive system, and so you get more nutrition out of the same amount of food, so you have an advantage when eating food. You get more energy out of it, so that means you have more energy to use whenever you're doing other tasks. You have predation. All right, either trying to catch something as a predator, fighting off a predator, fighting a prey, avoiding a predator, escaping a predator. Right, these are all variables that can be influenced by physical traits that different individuals have, different variation in those individuals. We have parasitism, the ability to avoid parasites, to remove parasites that might affect your body, maybe either through immune system or physically understanding how to get them removed from your body. A lot of animals deal with this aspect of existence through symbiotic relationships, through mutualism, where they will clean each other, or they will one organism's parasites will be the food for another organism. So for example, a water buffalo and elephants and rhinos, they normally have flocks of small birds that live on and around their area, so that they can land on them and take ticks and other parasitic insects off of their body, and they become the food source for the birds. So sometimes a mutual relationship is really the best way for something to deal with this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical trait, but also can be a behavioral trait that they develop. Disease, fighting off disease, your immune system, how well you're good at tolerating or dealing with diseases is also going to be linked to your genetics. competition for mates, the ability to reproduce. Not just getting to survive doesn't necessarily mean that you get to reproduce. A lot of organisms then also have to fight for access to females, either attracting females, which is very common in birds, fighting for females, which is common in reptiles and common in lots of different mammals, deer and rams, lions, they all fight with each other in order to see which one's going to be the dominant male that gets to reproduce. Selecting for males versus females, there's a lot of behavioral things that are passed down from generation to generation that are used by males and females in different groups in order to try to pick the best individual, right? Sometimes there might be something relatively obscure to us, like the size of the antlers or the coloration on the side of the fish, but whatever it means to them, it translates into somebody who's worth reproducing with because of those physical traits. And then competition for space, obviously fighting over a shelter, a living area, a nesting area, a reproductive space, protecting any resources that might be located in that area as well. So these are all just examples of sources of conflict when we're struggling for survival. And so it could be a single very strong attribute that's causing this natural selection of a population over time, but more often than not, it's going to be multiple factors all contributing to the survival of certain individuals over other ones, leading to the change and development of certain traits and evolution, and eventually evolution of the population. So before we get into our specific examples of bacterial resistance in Darwin's finches, let's just map out the process of natural selection as which we assume that it's going to occur. So basically a population is first going to has variation, of course. Population must have variation first, right? Then it's going to produce way more offspring than that environment is going to be able to support, or there could be a change in the environment. Maybe there's a shift in weather, there's more extreme weather than there was before. Global warming is having a huge impact on different populations all around the world because it's making the summers hotter, the winters colder in different parts of the earth, and the weather is becoming more extreme. And so it's having a new selective pressure that wasn't necessarily there before. Okay, and so because of this, eventually there's going to be a very strong struggle for survival, or what we call a selection pressure. The environment is putting pressure on some individuals to survive, and that pressure is not even. Some individuals, the pressure is stronger than others based on their variation. So variation in the population, variation also has to be inherited. That's a key point. If there's a disadvantaged variation, something that selects against because of the natural forces, more likely that organism dies, which means they're less likely to reproduce and pass their genes on. So there's a decrease in those genes and the frequency of those genes, and they might even disappear entirely from the population given enough time. Some that are advantageous variations that increase survival, they're more likely to reproduce, which adds those genes to the gene pool, to the overall number of genes or copies of those genes present inside that reproducing population of the species. And so that increases the frequency that those genes get passed on and that those genes are present in the population. And so if this continues over many generations, eventually, after enough time, we can conclude that that allele frequency or those genes have increased enough that we would say that the population now has evolved, and now it is an established part of all of the members of the population of their genetic code. And since everyone now has this trait, it has evolved to have this trait be a part of those organisms. And so that's eventually where evolution leads from this natural selection. Now, obviously, evolution is a relatively slow process in most instances. However, the faster the reproductive rate of the species, the development rate of the species, the faster we can see evolution occurring, because we see the genes fluctuating as members of the population decrease and other members of the population increase, depending on those variations, the different traits that they have. And since they're reproducing fairly quickly, those genes that are advantageous will spread through the population faster, ultimately leading to actual evolution. So one of the fastest forms of evolution is where we think of microevolution, or evolution of bacteria or microscopic organisms, since they reproduce quite quickly. So imagine this: we have a bacteria strain, right? And because of that bacteria strain, it goes through the process of reproduction, and then ultimately, after so many reproductions, it starts creating a little bit of variation. And so that variation is basically these proteins on the surface of the membrane of the bacterial cell's membrane. And so they come in different types. We've got the round type, we've got the triangle type, and we've got the square type. And so they might do different activities that are relatively equal to each other, but the reason why they are an advantage is because of how we use antibiotics. And so if antibiotics are going to help fight off a disease, help fight off this bacterial infection, what the antibiotics have to do is they have to identify the bacteria cells. We have to actually know that they're bacterial cells so that our white blood cells can remove them from our body. And so that's what antibiotics can do. So antibiotics can bind to these proteins sticking on the outside of the membrane, and when they do that, the white blood cells, they're basically highlighting them for the white blood cells so that the white blood cells will find them faster and destroy them. So we produce this variation, and then they go through a series of reproduction, and maybe somebody starts to feel ill, right? And so they go to the hospital, and we give them some antibiotics so that they can start to feel better. And the antibiotics we give them match only 2 of the 3 variations. Then we have the triangle type and the square type are attacked by the antibiotics. And since the antibiotics are sticking to them because their shapes are the same, their protein structures on the outside are the same, these ones end up getting removed from the body fairly quickly by the white blood cells. The round type, however, don't, because they're not getting highlighted by these antibiotics. The white blood cells can find them, but it's kind of random if they bump into them and realize that they're there. So they have more time, they have a better survival rate around the white blood cells, so that gives them more time to reproduce. And so we see that the population starts to evolve. And so eventually, what we would consider to be the resistant bacteria becomes the new dominant bacterial cell in your body, or possibly in a population if this is a disease spreading through the population. We can keep using the antibiotics that we used earlier with the red and purple type, but it's not going to do anything. It's not going to be able to stop them.
I don't have the answer to that.
Sorry, Siri. We're not going to be able to stop them because the antibiotics don't really do anything to fight off the disease. So then we would say, because those antibiotics no longer affect that specific strain of the bacteria, it is now a antibiotic resistant bacteria. And so the problem is, if this resistance, the gene that makes them resistant, starts to spread to other populations of the same bacteria strain, eventually maybe all of the existing bacteria strains in an area might become resistant. And then if people get infected with that disease, with that bacteria, they can have a disease that we can't cure. And that would be a major problem. So this is a huge fear for us in the medical community about how we're going to continue to fight against these evolving bacteria as we keep finding new antibiotics and they eventually start to become resistant to them. It's like an arms race. So to give you an example of when this has actually happened, we think of Streptococcus aureus bacteria. And so it has evolved an antibiotic resistance. So there were 2 variations of it. We have methicillin, and methicillin is an antibiotic, right? And so methicillin resistant versus methicillin susceptible. So resistant meaning that it will not really be affected by the antibiotic, versus susceptible meaning that it can be affected by it. Maybe not guaranteed to kill it, but it's more likely that it will die, and so you can use it to treat the disease. So because of the variation occurred, we have MRSA and MSSA. Eventually, application of methicillin removed all of the MSSA, right? So they were all killed, but the MRSA is resistant to it, so it survives. And now, because we've removed all of the resistant ones, the only ones surviving, the only ones continuing to reproduce and survive in the area, or survive on the petri dish, for example, are the MRSA. And so all the MRSA are going to reproduce, and that resistant gene that made them resistant to the methicillin gets spread throughout their population as they copy each other, just like bacterial cells do, going through binary fission. And so eventually essentially creates an entire population that is resistant to the bacteria, and now the bacteria, if it spreads to other people around the world, it's quite difficult for us to do anything about it because they are no longer affected by our best weapon, our methicillin antibiotic. Now we need to use a different antibiotic, maybe even a stronger antibiotic, but then we worry is if we keep using these different antibiotics and stronger antibiotics, will we just encourage this group to evolve again to eventually become more resistant to it? So this is a problem that we're dealing with in the medical community. Luckily, after a few decades of research into this topic, it seems like there is a limit to how many different antibiotics bacteria can be resistant to. So if the bacteria strain becomes resistant to antibiotics that were used back in the 80s or the 70s, there's a chance in the next few decades we could use it again and they might have lost that resistance, right? As they became resistant to new antibiotics that were used in the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s. The earlier resistance to something back in the 70s and 80s, they might lose that resistance because they're not using it anymore. So there's a chance that possibly cycling through different antibiotics could be a way of solving this issue. But again, we don't necessarily have enough research right now. We have to keep looking into different strains of bacteria and how they are evolving to deal with these antibiotics that we're developing. Okay, and so finally we're going to get into the example of Darwin's finches, which is another, again, fantastic real-world example of how an environment with natural selection is going to cause adaptation and eventual evolution in various populations. And it's also a really good example of adaptive radiation, which is where we're seeing from a single origin point, we can have lots of small variations in traits leading to different species because of environmental factors influencing different groups. And so basically what we're talking about with Darwin's finches is we have here the Galapagos Islands here. And on the Galapagos Islands we have a whole bunch of different species of finches. And so all those finches on each island are independent from each other because they don't really have the ability to travel across from one island to another. So there's a lot of speculation about exactly what happened, but we believe that there was some type of ancestral finch species that had ended up on these islands in some type of battering, and then they got spread around possibly due to storms at different times in the year. But eventually, from this ancestral starting group of species of finch, these isolated groups on these different islands became permanently isolated, and so they're stuck on the island, and their survival was dependent on the food source that was available to them. And so if we look at the food source that is available on the different islands, over time there have seemed to have been a physical adaptation of the size and strength and shape of the bird's beak in order to best deal with that food source. For example, islands where there are mostly insect species that are going to be their source of nutrition, birds started to develop longer, thinner beaks that were better at digging into the earth or digging into sections of wood under bark under trees and things like that in order to grab these insects as a source of energy. On islands where there are mostly ground nuts, harder nuts, example, the beaks became larger and stronger in order to crack these nuts and break them up so that the bird can consume them. And so the physical attributes of the birds from this common ancestor started to change slightly from each other as they've been isolated for hundreds and thousands of years on these islands, creating these different groups of finches, which is what we're calling adaptive radiation. It's the food source that's driving this adaptation, this variation that we're seeing in all these different populations. So he deduced from studying all these finches, or Darwin did, that's why we call them Darwin's finches, because he studied them so well, that they must have come from the mainland and they adapted to their new habitats, and then so over millions of years, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, their beaks adapted to be best suited to the environment, to that food source, creating our adaptive radiation. And so if we want to look at these environmental factors leading to changes in the environment in real time, not change in the environment, changes to the population, because of the environment in real time, we can look at the data of these finches. And so they're still relatively well studied today. We're constantly collecting data on them. And so we can look at an example from the medium ground finch and how evolution kind of occurred in terms of beak shape and beak size because of shifts in weather. So the variation is we have both size of the beak and the shape of the beak. Is it a large beak? Is it a small beak? Is it more pointed or is it less pointed, more round in terms of shape? And so they are a species that is endemic to the Galapagos Islands, and so they stay in the Galapagos Islands. One specific island we'll be looking at. And so they habitat in these kind of arid lowland forest and shrublands. And so arid means they're relatively hot, relatively dry. And so they generally feed on seeds, but they also can feed on insects and fruits of cactus, depending on what's in season. And so environmental conditions like weather can lead to effects into how frequent the seeds and the insects and the cacti fruit are available to the birds, and ultimately that could affect which beak size is going to be the most beneficial over long periods of time. So if we were to look at the data of our beak size and our beak shape, we see that in terms of the beak size, which is the top part, the red line, it started off large, relatively large in terms of the amount of variation in terms of largeness, and then over time there seemed to be a steep drop leading up to 1975 in terms of beak size. Beaks coming much smaller than average, and then after 1975 it rose back up, hitting a new height in terms of beak size. And then moving onwards, it's kind of started to level out, and beak size in general was decreasing, fluctuating a little bit, but in general it was decreasing to about an average size, so not too small and not too big. In terms of the beak shape, we see that in becoming, so it started off relatively rounded, started to become more pointed, all right, slightly less round, not necessarily pointed, but definitely less round, and then drop back down again. And then there was a sudden spike in terms of pointedness. And so pointedness seems to be the new trend. And so if we look at this overall trend, we would see that there's been fluctuations in both beak size and pointedness. But in general, over time, beak size has gone from being not too large and not too small to maybe just a little bit small, so generally decreasing over time. And beak pointedness has fluctuated in terms of roundness and pointedness, but now seems to be purely in the pointed zone. And so it's just variations on how pointed they might be. And so we have the red arrow and the orange arrow. And so these arrows are indicating some important information about the environment that might have been driving the changes that we're seeing here. All right, so the first one, the red arrow, is this environmental change that happened in 1974 leading into 1977. And this is La Nina, which basically created environmental condition which caused a shortage in smaller seeds. And so the amount of small seeds decreased. All right, and so that means that larger seeds, so we have to see the beaks are relatively small here, right, during the time that this is occurring. And so that means the small seeds can be eaten by the small creatures, but there aren't really that many small seeds left over for all of the birds. So since small seeds are in a smaller supply, having a larger beak is probably more of an advantage, because as a larger beak, you're more likely to be able to eat both the small seeds and larger seeds because you have a beak that can handle both. If you are a smaller beaked bird, you're only really going to be able to eat smaller seeds. You don't necessarily have the ability to eat the larger seeds because they are too large in order for you to easily eat. So having a small beak size is a disadvantage. Having a larger beak size is an advantage, and so we start to see why there could possibly be an increase in beak size very quickly after this environmental event. This might also account for roundness versus peaks. There might be an advantage to having a more peak or less round shaped beak in terms of the seed supply, and also might mean an advantage in eating other types of nutrition like the cacti fruit. Then we look at the green. The second environmental change is here we have heavy rains in the El Niño event, which caused an abundance of smaller beak size. And so with the abundance of smaller beak size, the small beak size is no longer being negatively effective, the large beak size isn't really that much of an advantage. So since both of them are kind of an equal advantage, and the small genes are still present in the population, we kind of see that the beak size is starting to decrease, is starting to become more averaged out, basically, because now the small beak size numbers are increasing because there's more small seeds available to them. That means more small beak genes in the gene pool, and so eventually of a kind of equal blending in terms of large and small beak size, and we see that really a smaller beak size might be a little bit more of an advantage in terms of eating these smaller seeds, so that we have an environmental condition that's driving that beak size. We also see a sudden increase in pointedness. So some environmental shift is driven this idea that pointedness is going to be an advantage. And so whatever that environmental shift is, if it's connected to the seeds, or maybe it's connected to an increase in the number of insects and the amount of fruit. And so having a pointed beak increased your probability of being able to get insects or be able to get fruit. So having a more pointed beak would have been a benefit to you. And so we see the pointed beaks starting to develop. They're starting to be increasing number because they are favored based on these environmental conditions. So what can we conclude from all of this? Populations in finches declined dramatically as a result of the first environmental change. The mean beak size for the finches was higher than before the drought. So basically the beak size increased because of this result of the drought. We also see the result of the second environmental change, that the overall generation's beak size started to decrease because the return of the small seeds allowed for kind of a more even blending of those large and small beak genes, allowing the population to kind of even out, and actually having a smaller beak size having a little bit more advantage in getting that food supply, and so that increased in our population. Okay, that is it for now. Hopefully this wasn't too confusing, and if you have any questions, you can come and see me.